Well, good evening. We've been exploring so far the question of origin, and especially the question of what does it mean to be human. And we've examined how our atheist friends try and answer that question purely in terms of the sciences and how that fails. And we've begun to dig into the biblical answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? Looking at Genesis 1, 26 and 27, and its profound teaching that human beings are made in the image of God. And we're unpacking the idea that there are three hugely important concepts that rest, that stand upon that biblical teaching that human beings bear God's image. From there, we get the idea that human beings have value. And we looked at that. But now we're going to look at two more. And we're going to begin our journey in the second part of this talk by looking at the foundation that the teaching in the Bible about the image of God has for ethics and morality. A hugely important subject. I live in Toronto, in Canada. I always put in Canada on the end when I talk in the USA. That's largely because Canadians are paranoid that no one in America even knows where Toronto is, maybe even where Canada is, quite frankly. It's just that great frozen lump to the north. But there we are. But I live in Toronto. And like many big cities, I often find that life in Toronto often appears to be cheap. People do not always treat each other well. Maybe that happens here in Chicago, I don't know. Life is so busy and life is so manic that often other people are seen as problems to solve rather than people to relate to. And you can understand why, can't you? Other people take up your time. They queue slowly in Starbucks and take far too long on a Monday morning to decide what drink they want. They get in your way on the subway. They cut you up at traffic intersections and all these terrible things. In fact, physicists have discovered that the shortest measurable unit of time in the known world, the shortest measurable unit of time in physics, is actually known as the Toronto second. And that's the interval between the light turning green and the car behind you honking. And it's the shortest unit of time that physicists can actually measure. Now, as I say, I often wonder if this is not a particular problem with Toronto, but with big cities in general, and in fact, Western culture in general. You see, we live in a culture, I think, that encourages us to treat other people as numbers, to see other human beings as part of a process, as things. But of course, if human beings are just things, if human beings are nothing more than cogs, bits, bytes, data points on the social graph, that raises a profound question, doesn't it? What's wrong with treating people like that? If the people sitting next to you as you watch this are nothing more than objects, then on what basis should we treat each other with compassion or with dignity? Not just our friends, but our enemies as well. What's the basis for treating other people with care and compassion? And again, I think the answer to that question, the only answer that I can see to that question that actually works, is to wrestle with, to take honestly and seriously that biblical teaching that every human being, friend or foe, is made in the image of God. In a very famous sermon that he gave in Oxford, C.S. Lewis, that tremendously influential Christian thinker, C.S. Lewis teases out this idea of the image of God and how it applies to humans and ethics by developing an argument that because every human being is made in God's image, because every human being is destined for eternity, therefore the way we treat each other now has huge consequences. Because the person that you are interacting with, the person who's sitting next to you, the person you greet at work, the person you buy your coffee from on your way to work, is not just a collection of molecules, but is someone who bears God's image. And that has profound theological implications. Listen to what C.S. Lewis wrote in this essay, The Weight of Glory. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would strongly be tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of those destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all of our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations and cultures and arts and civilization, those are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. but it is immortals that we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Lewis here betraying his Anglican roots. You don't need to be Church of England to get to heaven, by the way, but why take chances? A few years ago, Ravi Zacharias, who many of you know and love, had a rare opportunity of speaking to an audience of senior Communist Party leaders in China. And as Ravi tells the story, before he spoke to them, before he addressed them, they had the opportunity to eat dinner together. And one of the things he did at that meal, Ravi asked his hosts if they would mind if he offered a thanks, offered a blessing for the meal. And by all means, he was told. After he'd spoken that evening, a woman came up to speak to Ravi afterwards, and she said this to him. She said, "Dr. Zacharias, I've never heard anyone pray before. Is that how Christians always pray?" And Ravi said, "Well, what do you mean? Unpack the question for me. What are you asking?" And she said, "Well, you prayed for the serving staff. You prayed for those who prepared the meal." And with tears in her eyes, she went on to say this. She said, "You know, communism teaches that we are all equal. But in reality, that is not what we practice. I've never even noticed the serving staff before. I've never even noticed them. Yet you prayed for them. Some of them you prayed for by name. What is it about Christianity that it would do this thing?" You see, the biblical teaching that we are made in the image of God provides the only foundation that I can possibly conceive of for treating other people that way, for treating all human beings, whether they are our friends or our family, or whether they are our enemies. People who exhaust you, people who tire you out, political leaders or colleagues who infuriate you, you name it, the good and the bad, for treating people with dignity and respect, treating people as more than our DNA, treating people as ends rather than means. Only the gospel, I think, gives us that power and that foundation. Yet if we are going to build the good society, if we are going to get along together, if we're going to solve some of the world's deepest problems, my word, do we need an answer to that question? Only the gospel, only the biblical worldview, I believe, does so. So the Bible gives us a foundation for human value. It gives us a foundation for morality and ethics. Lastly, thirdly, it gives us a foundation for dignity, for human dignity, in a way that no other worldview even comes close. And that is tremendously important. In fact, it gets even more important every day, I believe, with some of the new challenges that present themselves to our culture. Let me illustrate. A friend of mine back in Canada is a medical student. He's a medical student at a leading Canadian medical school. I won't mention which one, and you'll understand why with where this story is going. One afternoon, he was sitting in a lecture in one of the largest auditoriums on the campus when the lecture was briefly halted to allow a group of female students to come and advertise a fundraising event for a charity. However, they didn't merely advertise the event by handing out flyers or by talking about it. They actually performed a sexually provocative dance at the front of the lecture theatre, modelled on Miley Cyrus and that whole fiasco, if you know that name. Very, very provocative. My friend's a Christian, and he was shocked, absolutely stunned, didn't know quite what to do. And as he thought about it, he decided what he would do is he would write a letter. And he wrote a letter to the student council, raising a number of questions about what he'd just seen, not least what he thought that particular promotion said about women and sexual exploitation. What does it say that we are exploiting female students in that way? What was interesting was he sparked a firestorm of discussion that spread across the campus. Many of the female students on campus agreed with him, and what was interesting is the leader of the dance troupe emailed him personally to apologise and to say he was right, that she'd read his letter and he was convinced that it was wrong. What was interesting, though, was most of the male students saw absolutely no problem with it, and in fact the debate on Facebook divided largely along male-female lines, with people shouting at each other across the gender divide. And of course, how do you shout on Facebook? You just type in capitals and include slightly less smiley faces. As part of that discussion on Facebook, one student at this medical school wrote an interesting statement, and my friend copied and pasted and emailed it to me and said, how do you respond to something like this? This was what was written in the middle of that Facebook thread. One student said this: many people are using the phrase human dignity, but I believe that no such thing as dignity actually exists. Many people are using the phrase human dignity, but I believe that no such thing as dignity actually exists. And I read that and my blood ran cold, because I thought, aside from all the other questions, this is a future doctor writing this. Future doctor writing this. How badly does that jar with something like the Hippocratic Oath that every doctor signs to commit themselves to a particular standard of patient care? It also, interestingly, conflicts with things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. If you read that document, that foundational document for human rights that's been so influential in our culture, at the heart of the UDHR, you will read this statement. Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And of course, many people sign on to that. Many of our secular friends will look at that and affirm and nod in agreement. But of course, it raises a profound question, doesn't it? It raises a deeply profound question. Where is that dignity located? Where precisely is human dignity located? Again, if I am feeling mischievous or iconoclastic or many of those things that come so easily to being British, along with sarcastic and a sense of superiority, which losing international sporting events beats out of us. I often like to use this illustration on university campuses. I like to take the whiteboard or the blackboard or whatever's available in the classroom. If there are none of those things, I'll just spray paint it on the wall and deal with it afterwards. It's always easier to ask forgiveness than permission. I like to draw a large circle up the front of the classroom when I'm faced with a secular audience of students. And I say, imagine this circle that I've just drawn represents all life on Earth. Everything is in here. Everything from amoeba to ants to aardvarks to lettuces to human beings to real estate agents. Everything there. All the highest and the lowest forms of life are represented there in that circle. Now, when we talk about human dignity and human rights, what are we doing? What are we actually doing when we talk about human rights and dignity? Well, here's what we're doing. We're drawing a smaller circle inside that larger circle. And we're saying, if you live inside that small circle, if your DNA is human, you have special dignity that nobody else does. You have a set of rights that amoebas and ants and aardvarks don't. Do we agree? And there's usually a bit of discussion, but eventually you'll get most of the students in the room to agree. That's at least broadly what we're doing. Well, here's the problem. What is to stop the white supremacist coming along and drawing a slightly smaller circle and saying, well, I disagree. I don't think it's human beings. I think if you are white and you are European and you're middle class, then you have human rights, but nobody else does. We would call that racist. But why? We've just drawn circles. The human rights advocate has drawn one circle, the white supremacist has drawn a different circle, but both have drawn circles arbitrarily. Why is one circle laudable? We give the Nobel Prize for one circle, and the other circle we consider anathema and beyond the pale. This is a huge problem for our atheist friends and my secular friends, how we divide that up, how we say that one is okay and one isn't. In fact, Sam Harris, another of the leading so-called new atheists, writes this in his book, The End of Faith, from a few years ago. He says, the problem is that whatever attribute we use to differentiate between humans and animals, intelligence, language use, moral sentiments, and so on, will equally differentiate between human beings themselves. How do we do it? If it's not from the colour of a person's skin, if it's not from their capacity and ability that we derive rights and dignity, where do we get it from? Where does it come from? Where did we derive this ethic that is so central to our culture? Many people, I think, have forgotten that it has a root. And that root is the biblical teaching that human beings are made in the image of God. That's where that idea comes from. That's where it first flowered. Consider the example of slavery for a moment. Just consider the example of slavery to illustrate this. As the historian Rodney Stark points out, it's interesting that throughout history, almost every society that has ever existed has at one point or other believed that it is okay for one human being to own another. The Greeks believed this, the Romans believed this, the Persians believed this, the Chinese believed this, the Arabs believed this, and then here, of course, in North America, and where I come from in Europe, that's been part of our history. Interestingly, before even Europeans arrived on the scene here in North America, many Aboriginal societies practiced slavery long before Europeans got here. It's been part of every civilization. But Rodney Stark says this, only one civilization. He said, only one civilization has ever formally rejected human bondage, and they did it twice. And that was Christendom. It happened twice. The first time was during the so-called Dark Ages, when slavery was banned throughout the Christian Empire, and the second time was during the 19th century, when Christians, led by William Wilberforce, the great British parliamentarian, led a 45-year political battle to eradicate slavery once and for all throughout the British Empire, Europe, and Russia. Of course, everybody now takes for granted the idea that slavery is wrong. But we have to ask, from where did Wilberforce and those other great campaigners, from where did they get the idea? Where did they derive the idea that it was wrong from? They got it from the belief that all human beings, regardless of skin color, regardless of race, have the image of God at the heart of who they are. That's where they got the idea from. Well, if that's true, that raises a profound question, doesn't it?
People are interested in having a spiritual life, but treat faith more like an a la carte menu at a restaurant, choosing what they like and dismissing the rest. Cutting through the hype and seduction is the clear voice of author and apologist Ravi Zacharias. In his book, Why Jesus? Rediscovering His Truth in an Age of Mass-Marketed Spirituality, Ravi answers the attraction known as the new spirituality. Billy Graham calls Why Jesus a powerful defense of how Jesus Christ brings meaning and hope to an individual life. And Charles Swindoll says, I am not acquainted with a brighter mind or a more relevant and devoted defender of the faith than Ravi Zacharias. Why Jesus? Available in bookstores now or online at rzim.org.
What happens if we neglect the source of an idea? How long can an idea carry on for in our culture if you forget the source? How long can our culture really hold on to human dignity, to human value, absent of any foundations? How many generations of students can we teach that human beings are just animals? We are just matter. There is no intrinsic value. How many generations of students can we teach that before they start acting it out? How many students can we teach that before they start believing it and behaving it? And as my friend at medical school in Canada found, they are already rejecting the language. They are typing on Facebook, there is no such thing as human dignity. It's one thing to type that. What happens when the next student gets the bright idea into his or her head to act that out and treat their patients accordingly? What kind of world will we live in? The atheist philosopher Raymond Gator, another atheist who I respect for his honesty, wrote this very honest reflection. He said, we may say that all human beings are inestimably precious, that they are ends in themselves, that they are owed unconditional respect, that they possess inalienable rights, and of course that they possess inalienable dignity. In my judgment, these are ways of trying to say what we feel and need to say when we are estranged from the conceptual resources we need to say it. Be that as it may, each is problematic and contentious. Not one of them has the simple power of the religious ways of speaking. Not one of them has the simple ways of the religious way of speaking. That is an atheist writing those words. You see, the biblical teaching, my friends, that human beings are not accidents, are not cosmic mistakes, but are made in the image of God, provides the foundation for human value. It provides the foundation for ethics. It provides the foundation for dignity, but it also offers the explanation of one last thing. In conclusion, I believe it offers the explanation for why our lives, why our world, and why our culture often looks the way that it does. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the challenges for secular naturalism, I believe, is to explain why human beings consistently go wrong in so many ways. It doesn't matter how much technology we have, how much advancement, how much economics, how much politics, how much education you pile into culture, we have not arrived at secular utopia. We have not arrived at utopia despite all of our advances. Why is that? Well, the poet Randall Jarrell wrote this. He said, most of us know that Rousseau was wrong, that man, when you knock his chains off, sets up the death camps. Soon we shall know everything that the 18th century didn't know and nothing it did, and it will be hard to live with us. It will be hard to live with us. If this is true, and I think most of my atheist friends on reading those words sort of nod begrudgingly, it raises a profound question. It raises a profound question, of course, for us as Christians. If human beings are made in the image of God, why is it that we are often so beastly to one another? Why is that the case if we are made in the image of God? Well, perhaps to answer that question as we draw to a close, it may be worth reflecting, pardon the pun, for a moment on what it means for something to be in the image of something. What's the nature of an image? Well, inherent in the idea of the word image is the idea of the word reflection. Inherent in the idea of the word image is often the idea of the word reflection. We judge the quality of a mirror by how accurately it reflects our face. Sometimes that may lead us to depression and anxiety, but that's how we judge the quality of a mirror. How good a likeness, how accurate a reflection it gives back to us. It's interesting that shortly after the launch of one of NASA's biggest projects, the Hubble Space Telescope, back in 1990, NASA had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a mission using the space shuttle to go and correct a tiny infinitesimal flaw in the main focusing mirror on the space telescope. It was ever so slightly out of shape and was producing poor images. Well, if human beings are made in the image of God, if we were created in God's image, that means we were designed, we were intended, we were purposed to reflect God, to image God, to reflect God's glory to the world. And so the question for each one of us then becomes this question, doesn't it? If you choose not to reflect God, if you are Richard Dawkins or Stephen Jay Gould or any of my atheist friends, who are you going to choose to reflect if not God? All of us, every single human being, have to choose to angle, as it were, the mirror of our soul at something. And if we don't reflect back at God, if we don't angle the mirror of our soul at God, we will choose something else to focus on. It may be work, it may be performance, it may be money, it may be family, or maybe, even like Narcissus of Greek legend, it may be ourselves and our own image, our beauty, our cleverness, our reputation, or even our integrity. But ultimately, if you focus on those things, if you make the point of your life those things, they will destroy you. Because no mirror can be the source of its own light. No mirror can be the source of its own light. Let me quote C.S. Lewis one last time. He writes, "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the seaside. We are far too easily pleased. We are far too easily pleased." So what's the solution? What do we do with this problem? How do we deal with the fact that the mirror of our souls is cracked and distorted and broken? We can't ask NASA to launch a multi-million-dollar space mission to rescue ourselves, to reorientate our own souls. Well, the answer is there in Scripture, because the biblical theme of the image of God that begins on the first page of the first book of the Bible, back there in Genesis, is a biblical theme that runs right through the whole of Scripture, from the very first page to the very last page. And in the New Testament, we find the answer to the question of how we solve that problem. Listen to these famous words from the Apostle Paul. Writing in Colossians chapter 1, Paul writes this: "God has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins." The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. You see, according to the Bible, brothers and sisters, according to the Bible, Jesus Christ is the perfect image of God. And more than that, not merely was he the perfect image of God, he was willing to be trampled on. He was willing to be rejected. He was willing to be broken for us, so that the broken image in us might be remade, forgiven, and restored. See, the story of Jesus' death and resurrection is a story that at its heart is about restoration. The promise that God has offered us in Christ to restore and recharge and renew the image of God that we have allowed to become so marred and twisted in each one of us. So it's interesting to reflect, again, pardon the pun, that if all we had was Genesis 1, imagine that the only page of the Bible that you had in your possession was Genesis chapter 1, we would know a few things. We would know that human beings have value. We would know that human beings have dignity. But we would have no way to get back to that image from where we have fallen. We could look back at the glorious past, as it were, and go, wow, that must have been amazing back at the time of creation. But we are now so far, what can we do? Thankfully, the Bible gives us far more than just Genesis chapter 1. The Bible tells the whole story, the entire of salvation history, the story of what God has done about that problem. And because of that, we have a true, a living, and a certain hope. A hope not for what God might do, but a hope for what God has done. A hope for what God has done in Jesus, in the true image of God, in the cross. You see, human beings are not, contra Dawkins and Gould and my atheist friends, human beings are not mere molecules and matter. We are not mere atoms and particles. We are not just the stuff of which we are made. We are more than the material that makes us up. We are more than our economic production. We are more than our biology. We are more than our sociology. We are more than our psychology. We are image bearers, each one of you, who bear tremendous value and significance, value so high that Jesus was prepared to pay the price of his life to redeem and restore that broken image so that the mirror of our souls might be angled again at him and reflect the true image of God as it was ever intended. Amen.
If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at rzim.org. You can also stay connected through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, P.O. Box 921939, Norcross, Georgia 30010.